The letter from First Caldwell Bank arrived on a Tuesday, which Norma Braddock would later decide was intentional. Banks always chose Tuesdays, not Mondays when a person still had the momentum of the weekend behind them, not Fridays when the coming days might soften the blow. Tuesdays arrived in the middle of everything, when there was nowhere to run and nothing to do but stand there and hold the paper. Norma stood in the barn at 5 in the morning, the letter in one hand and a flashlight in the other, and she did not open it. She already knew the number inside. $180,000 due in 14 months, with interest accrued against the property value of the 340 acres her grandfather had farmed for 51 years before he died. She had borrowed against those acres when the well pump failed, when the east fence line collapsed, when 3 consecutive droughts had eaten through what the previous season had saved. She had borrowed carefully and sensibly and with full understanding of what she was doing, and now the understanding had arrived in an envelope she still had not opened. Instead, she set the letter on the workbench beside the seed organizer and picked up a different kind of document entirely. The notebook was old, not decorative old, not the kind of old people put on coffee tables and call rustic. This was working old. The cover had been repaired with electrical tape twice. The binding had been reinforced with a strip of leather that did not match the original color. The pages inside were dense with handwriting that grew smaller as the years passed, as though the man writing had been trying to fit more and more into the space he had left. Clifford Braddock's handwriting covered every page. Norma opened the notebook to a section near the middle, marked with a strip of corn husk she had placed there years ago. The entry was dated August 1989. Sugar profile notably complex. Fermentation behavior unlike commercial varieties. Kernel development inconsistent, but flavor retention exceptional. Market uncertain. She had read those words enough times to see them when she closed her eyes. Market uncertain. Clifford had underlined that phrase 3 times. Once in pen, once in pencil, once again in pen darker than the first. She used to think that was a warning. Now she was not entirely sure. She closed the notebook without opening the bank letter, tucked both under her arm, and went to check on the seed supply. February in Caldwell County arrived like an uninvited relative who expected to stay. The cold came sideways off the fields and had a specific quality Norma had never been able to describe to anyone who had not grown up there. Not sharp, not biting, not stinging, just relentless. A cold that did not threaten so much as simply remain. She drove the county road to the co-op that morning with the heater running loud and the radio off, watching the frost patterns on the windshield where the defroster was not quite reaching. The co-op smelled the same way it had smelled for 30 years. Feed grain and machine oil and the specific synthetic warmth of commercial fluorescent lights over concrete floors. 12 men were already there when Norma arrived. She recognized every face. She had grown up knowing every face. They stood around the seed display tables the way men stand around anything they have already decided about, which is to say they stood comfortably and without urgency. Walt Doer was holding a bag of Pioneer hybrid corn and nodding at something Perry Stills was saying. Walt was 58 years old and owned more acreage than anyone else in the county and knew it and did not apologize for it. He was not a bad man. He was a precise man. He had organized his life around the maximization of measurable outcomes, and it had worked well for him. And so he had very little patience for approaches that could not be measured. Norma walked past the display tables toward the catalog rack near the back wall. Walt noticed within 30 seconds. She saw his posture shift in her peripheral vision, the slight recalibration that people make when something unexpected enters their field of awareness. He walked over. He was carrying his coffee because Walt Doer always carried coffee, and he looked at the catalog she had pulled from the rack, and then he looked again. Norma had the catalog open to page 47. Heirloom Specialty Varieties Ozark Regional. Subheading, Sweet Corn Heritage Strains, Low Commercial Yield, Flavor Profile, Exceptional. Walt pointed at the catalog. That is not what I think it is. Norma smiled faintly. Good morning, Walt. He pointed again. You are not seriously looking at garden corn. She turned another page. I like it. He laughed. That is not how farming works. She closed the catalog. I know how farming works. The room had shifted slightly toward their conversation, the way rooms do when something interesting might be happening. Walt looked over his shoulder once, just briefly, not because he wanted an audience, but because he was the kind of man who always knew where his audience was. He turned back to Norma. You are telling me you are going to plant that on actual acreage? She put the catalog under her arm. I am going to plant it on my actual acreage, yes. Walt looked at the catalog, then at her, then at Perry Stills across the room. Perry raised his eyebrows. Walt shook his head slowly, the way people shake their heads when they want credit for restraint. He laughed once more when she walked to the counter to place her order, and the laughter spread around the room the way laughter always spreads in small spaces. Not mean, not targeted. The casual, involuntary kind of laughter that happens when something strikes people as genuinely absurd. Norma ordered 1,200 pounds of heirloom sweet number 7. The woman at the counter typed it without comment. Norma signed the form and left. In the truck, she sat for a moment before starting the engine. The laughter did not sting the way she might have expected. What it did was settle into a specific place, a place she had learned to keep things that might matter later. She filed it there carefully and drove home. The corn she had chosen was not new. That was the first thing people misunderstood about it. They assumed she was experimenting, trying something novel, chasing a trend in artisan agriculture, the way some farmers had started doing in the early years of that decade. She was not. Heirloom sweet number 7 had been grown in the Ozark region intermittently since the 1940s. The variety had developed through natural selection and deliberate saving over several decades, which meant that by the time Clifford Braddock had first acquired a seed sample in 1977, it already carried 30 years of accumulated regional adaptation. It knew the soil and the rainfall and the temperature range of those hills, the way anything knows a place it has grown in for a long time. Clifford had recognized something in it immediately. Norma had been 14 years old the summer he walked her through the experimental field behind the barn. Not the main field where the commodity corn grew in the organized rows that fed into the commodity market and produced the commodity income that kept the farm operational. The backfield was smaller, irregular in shape, tucked against a low ridge that caught the afternoon sun at an angle that made the whole area feel slightly warmer than the surrounding land. Clifford had been growing different varieties there for years, mostly corn, some wheat, several kinds of beans he never brought to market. The backfield was where he was still trying to understand things. He stopped beside one particular row and pulled an ear without ceremony. He stripped the husk partway back, offered it to her. She bit into the kernels. The sweetness arrived immediately, but it was not simple sweetness. There were layers to it, a complexity her 14-year-old understanding could not name precisely, but could register clearly. Something deep behind the immediate sugar, something that lingered after swallowing, something that reminded her of the taste of late summer air on a hot afternoon. She frowned. That is really good. Clifford nodded once. Yes. She looked at the row. Why does not everyone grow this? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the corn the way he looked at most things, with the specific kind of attention that meant he was considering whether there was a version of the truth simple enough to be useful. Then he said, because everybody is chasing yield. She did not fully understand that at 14. By the time she was 30, she understood it better than almost anything else she knew about farming. Yield and value were not the same category. They were related categories, overlapping in some conditions and entirely separate in others. The commodity market treated them as identical. Clifford had spent the last 20 years of his life documenting the ways they were not. What she had not understood until much later, not until she had gone through every notebook carefully after his death, was that he had tried to sell this corn before. In 1981, 2 years before she was born, Clifford Braddock had planted 40 acres of heirloom sweet number 7 and brought the harvest to every buyer within 100 miles. The responses had been consistent: low yield, non-standard ear size, no established market, no price support mechanism. One buyer had offered him a rate slightly above livestock feed. Clifford had declined. He had sold a portion of that harvest at a loss through a roadside stand and let the rest go. He had spent the following winter not giving up, but reorganizing. He had begun keeping systematic records. He had continued growing small test plots. For 16 years until he died, he had been building a case in notebooks that nobody else had read. Norma had read every page of every notebook. She understood something that Walt Doer, Grant Ferris, and every man in that co-op room did not, which was that her decision to plant this corn on serious acreage was not a romantic gesture or an inexplicable eccentricity. It was the completion of something started before she was born, continued past the point of setback, and handed to her along with the land and the debt and the leather-bound notebooks and the strip of corn husk she used as a bookmark in the most important entry. She planted the first full acreage crop in the spring of 2007. Bev Tanner came by that afternoon as she came by most afternoons in spring in the habit of decades. Bev was 70 years old and had farmed the neighboring property with her husband until Leonard died in 2002, and since then had kept the land leased and herself occupied through a combination of gardening, visiting, and saying things that other people preferred not to say out loud. She was the best neighbor Norma had, which meant she was also the person most capable of finding the precise pressure point in any situation. She found it within 15 minutes of arriving. She had seen the seed delivery that morning. She had seen the weight on the delivery manifest because Bev Tanner had a talent for reading manifests from across a parking lot. She sat at the kitchen table with coffee and looked at Norma with an expression that was not unkind. "Your grandfather tried this," she said. "He died with debt." Norma refilled her own coffee. "He died with notebooks, too." Bev was quiet for a moment. Norma. The way she said the name had its own whole sentence inside it. "I know," Norma said. "Do you?" Bev set her cup down carefully. "Because knowing and deciding are two different things, and I want to make sure you are doing the second one on purpose." Norma sat down across from her. "What is in that notebook," Bev said, "that is worth losing the farm?" Norma thought about the question seriously the way Bev intended it to be taken. Then she said, "Everything he could not finish." Bev looked at her for a long time. She nodded once, a small, reluctant nod that acknowledged the answer without endorsing the decision. She finished her coffee and left without saying anything else. That was the most serious thing Bev Tanner could do, which was to recognize when there was nothing left to say. The first season was difficult in the way learning is always difficult when you are learning from a notebook written by someone who is no longer available to clarify. Clifford's records were thorough, but they were not instructional. They described outcomes and observations, not procedures. Norma spent that first summer translating his observations into her own decisions, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. By harvest, she had recovered enough of his method to produce something worth keeping. The second season went better. The third season, the harvest of 2009, was genuinely beautiful. She stood at the edge of the field in September and could see it clearly, the difference that the records had been building toward. The ears were not uniform. That was still true. The corn still grew at different rates in different parts of the field, still showed the variations in development that made commodity buyers immediately suspicious. But the flavor, if you bit into a raw kernel and paid attention, was something else entirely. It was the flavor her grandfather had been trying to get someone to understand for 16 years. She brought samples to the co-op in October. Grant Ferris stood behind the counter and studied the ears with the expression of a man who was professionally required to form an opinion. Grant was 61 years old and had been managing the Caldwell County Agricultural Cooperative for 19 years, and had developed in that time a specific kind of institutional caution that prevented him from being surprised by anything in a way that could later be called enthusiasm. He called an employee over, then another employee. Norma noticed Walt Doer standing near the back wall, arms folded, watching the proceedings. He was not laughing, he was watching. Grant turned an ear over in his hands. "What variety is this?" Norma told him. Silence. "Then you actually planted production acreage with it?" "Yes." Grant set the ear down carefully. He looked at her. "Norma." He paused. "This is not commercial sweet corn." She kept her voice even. "It is sweet corn. You know what I mean." He looked at the kernels again. "Processors will not take it. Commodity buyers will not touch it. Large distributors will not catalog it." The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something that was already decided is being formally confirmed. "So who buys it?" Norma asked. Grant's face did something complicated. "Maybe roadside stands. Maybe local fresh markets." Long pause. "Feed grade pays something." The room did not burst into laughter this time. It was smaller than that. A few chuckled sounds, the kind that come from the back of the throat and are almost involuntary. The casual kind. The kind that hurt more than the open kind, because they mean people have already moved past the point of taking something seriously. Norma picked up her sample tray. She did not respond. She carried the tray to the truck and drove home, and did not speak for most of the drive, because the words in her head were not the kind she wanted to say out loud to anyone. Feed grade. The drive home was long. She knew the road by heart and drove it without thinking, which meant her thinking went elsewhere, to the number in the unopened bank letter, now open and sitting on the kitchen table, and to the stacked harvest crates in the barn, and to the 16 years of notebooks describing a market that apparently still did not exist. Della was waiting at the house when she got back. Della Braddock was 26 years old and had a degree in agricultural science from the University of Missouri and opinions about most things. She had grown up on this land, had spent her childhood in these fields, and had loved it, and then questioned it, and then studied it, and now was trying to figure out what she actually thought about it, independent of both love and academic training. She had come home 3 months ago to help with the harvest. She had stayed because she could see the situation more clearly from close proximity than she could from a distance. "You okay?" she asked. Norma laughed once. "The short kind, the kind that comes out when the alternative is something else. The co-op thinks I grew cattle feed." Della blinked. "What?" "Feed grade. That is their official assessment." Long silence. Della looked at the sample tray. Then she said, "That might be the dumbest thing I have heard this week." Norma smiled slightly. "Might be." She did not say what she was thinking, which was that the dumbest thing and the practically accurate thing could be the same thing simultaneously. That was the specific problem with their situation. The corn was exceptional. The corn had no established market. Both of those facts were true at exactly the same time. That night, after Della had gone to bed, Norma sat at the kitchen table with the bank letter and the open notebook. The letter said 14 months. The notebook said on the last page Clifford had ever written, in 1996, a year before he died, in handwriting smaller than any other entry, "Somebody will understand it, just not yet." She read that line until the kitchen light made her eyes tired. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that things are quiet when a large and unresolved question sits inside every room. Norma brought small quantities of the corn to local markets and roadside stands. The response from customers was immediate and consistent. The people who tasted it came back. They came back the following week and the week after that, and they told other people. A restaurant in Bolivar called to ask about regular supply. A specialty food store in Springfield placed a small order. The demand was real. It was just not large, not remotely large enough. She did the arithmetic multiple times in different arrangements, and it kept coming out the same way. Local direct sales at premium prices covered perhaps a quarter of what she needed to make the harvest economically viable at the scale she had planted. The rest sat in the barn or risked going to feed grade after all. Della watched her mother work through the numbers and said, in October, during a particularly quiet dinner, "Mom," she said it the way Bev had said, "Norma," with a whole sentence inside the single word. "I hear you," Norma said. Della set down her fork. Do you? She paused. Because I have been doing the math too, and I do not see how this works. Norma looked at her daughter. I am not saying you were wrong to do it, Della said. I am saying that being right about the quality does not automatically create the market to match it. She paused again. Grandpa knew that too. That is why those notebooks exist. The room was quiet. Norma said, I know. Then what is the plan? Della asked. Norma did not have an answer for that. Not yet. She looked out the window at the dark field, at the rows of corn standing in the October night, and she thought about a man who had grown this corn for 16 years without ever finding the market for it. And she thought about the fact that she had known that before she planted it, and she had planted it anyway. And she was not entirely sure what that said about her. It was 9 days later that she heard the truck. She was in the barn checking the storage humidity on the remaining harvest crates, making notes in her own notebook, which had developed the same density of observation as Clifford's over the past 3 seasons. The sound reached her before the vehicle was visible, a particular low register of engine that did not belong to any vehicle she knew. She stepped to the barn door. A dark green delivery truck was rolling down the farm lane. Out-of-state plates, she could see that from 50 yards. Dust covered the lower body, as though it had traveled all day on roads the vehicle was not quite designed for. It moved slowly, which meant the driver was reading the numbers on the mailbox and watching the property carefully, the way people move when they are looking for something specific. It stopped in the yard. The man who climbed out was tall and gray-haired, and had the particular tiredness of someone who had been on the road since before dawn. He stood beside his truck for a moment, looking at the barn, then at the field, and then at the stacked harvest crates near the loading area. When his eyes found the crates, they stopped moving. He walked toward them with the specific directness of someone who has found what they traveled a long distance to find. Then he found Norma standing in the barn door. He was 64 years old and looked like he had spent all of those years outdoors. His face had the kind of weathering that comes from actual weather, not sun exposure or hard living, but simply decades of being present in the elements. He crossed the yard and extended his hand. Cobb Lawton. His voice was unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had never found a reason to rush through a sentence. Norma Braddock, she said. They shook hands. He walked to the nearest crate and picked up an ear of corn. He turned it in his hands the way a person turns something they recognize. Then he looked at her and asked a question that no one from the co-op, no buyer, no grain broker, no extension agent, no person who had looked at this corn in the past 3 years had ever thought to ask. Can I taste it? Norma looked at him. He noticed. Is that an unusual question? She said, a little. He stripped back the husk. The September light caught the kernels. He bit into the corn, and then the yard went quiet in a way that was entirely different from the quiet of the co-op, because this was the quiet of someone paying complete attention. He chewed slowly, then slower. He looked at the ear in his hand, then at the field, then back at the ear, then at Norma. He said, "Good grief." She waited. He took another bite. Where did you get this variety? And for the first time, someone was asking because they genuinely wanted to know. She told him, all of it. Clifford Braddock in the experimental field, and the 16 years of notebooks, and the 1981 failure, and the careful documentation, and the 1996 entry written a year before his death. She told him about the 3 seasons she had planted, and the co-op assessment, and the feed grade pronouncement, and the careful arithmetic of a market that did not match the quality. She told him more than she had told almost anyone because he asked follow-up questions. Good ones, specific ones, the kind that come from actual understanding rather than politeness. Cobb Lawton listened the way people listen when they are learning something they have been trying to understand for a long time. When she finished, he looked out at the field. The afternoon wind moved through the rows slowly, a long, continuous motion that made the whole field seem to breathe. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I knew it. Knew what? He held up the ear. This is not commodity corn. That is what everyone keeps telling me, she said. He shook his head. No. He looked at her directly. I mean that as a compliment. The next 2 hours disappeared the way hours disappear when something important is happening and no one wants to interrupt it. Cobb walked the field the way Norma had walked it herself 3 years ago, when she was still learning from the notebooks. He moved slowly and without apology, stopping at intervals to examine individual plants, comparing ears from different sections of the field, occasionally crouching to look at the soil near the base of a stalk. He did not explain what he was looking for. He did not need to. Norma had spent enough time in this field to recognize the movements of someone who actually understood what they were looking at. At one point, he simply stopped in the middle of a row and stood there eating corn directly from the stalk, not speaking, not moving, just standing in the September afternoon with his eyes slightly unfocused, the way eyes go when a person is paying attention to something internal. Della, who had come out from the house when she heard the unfamiliar truck, stood next to Norma at the field edge, and they both watched him. Della said quietly, "What does he do exactly?" Norma said, "Whiskey." Della was silent for a moment. "Whiskey, small batch bourbon, specialty production." Long pause. "And you think he drove all this way for corn?" Norma said, "I think he drove all this way for this corn." Della looked at the man standing motionless in the corn rows. She said, "I need more information before I'm comfortable with this." That was a fair assessment, and Norma did not argue with it. When Cobb came back to the yard, he was carrying 3 ears he had pulled from different sections of the field, and he had the look of someone who had confirmed something they had been hoping to confirm for a considerable time. He set the ears on the hood of his truck and leaned against it, and looked at Norma and said, "I have been looking for 3 years." She waited. 11 states. He said it without drama, just as a fact. 17 farms. 4 different specialty grain operations. He looked at the ears. "I knew what I needed. I had the flavor profile, I had the fermentation characteristics, I had the botanical markers." He paused. "I could not find the source." Norma said, "What exactly are you making?" He described it without using language that would have meant anything to the co-op. A single grain bourbon using non-commercial grain as the sole mash component. The flavor complexity came entirely from the character of the grain itself, which meant the grain had to be genuinely complex, not the engineered uniformity of commercial hybrids. What he was describing was a process that required exactly the kind of inconsistency that Grant Ferris had identified as a problem. The inconsistency was the point. Norma said, "Nobody here would have told you that." Cobb smiled. "No, that is why I am here instead of talking to the co-op." She handed him a bottle of water from the cooler by the barn door. He drank half of it and looked at the field again. She said, "My daughter wants to ask you some questions." He looked toward Della, who had not moved from her position 12 feet away, and was watching the entire conversation with the focused patience of someone composing a list of objections. "She is right to," he said. "People who make decisions without asking questions do not last long." Della walked over. She looked at Cobb Lawton with an expression that contained both genuine assessment and preemptive skepticism in equal measure. She said, "We do not know you. We do not know your company. We have had people come through here before with promises and nothing else." Cobb did not defend himself. He reached into the cab of his truck and came back with a laptop, which he opened on the hood beside the corn ears. He turned it toward Della and walked her through it systematically. Company registration, 40 years of operating history, current distribution partners, production certifications, existing grain contracts, a list of small farms currently supplying his operation with specialty ingredients. Della read carefully, asking questions about specific line items, and Cobb answered each one with the kind of precision that comes from someone who actually runs an operation versus someone who has prepared a presentation about one. After 20 minutes, Della closed the laptop. She did not say she was satisfied. She said, "I will want copies of those documents." Cobb said, "I will send them tonight." She stepped back, but did not leave the yard. Her presence remained a kind of ongoing audit. Cobb turned to Norma. "I want to take samples tonight. Full lab work, fermentation studies, mash behavior analysis." He paused. If the results come back the way I expect, I will be back with a contract offer. Norma said. How long? He considered. 3 weeks, maybe 4. She said, okay. He loaded the coolers, carefully labeling each sample's field position, asking about harvest date, storage conditions, moisture levels. He worked efficiently and with the specific attention to detail that belongs to someone for whom the variables actually matter. When he was finished, he shook Norma's hand again, then Della's, and drove away down the farm lane in the early evening light. Della and Norma stood in the yard until the truck was gone. Della said he might be real. Norma said he might be. He might also not come back. I know. They went inside. The weeks that followed were the particular kind of difficult that comes not from activity, but from waiting. Norma continued her daily work with the mechanical focus she applied to everything that required endurance. She harvested the remaining sections of the field, finished the storage preparation, kept the records current. She brought small loads to the local markets and the restaurant in Bolivar, which had begun featuring the corn as a seasonal specialty and charging accordingly. The response from customers continued to be consistent. People tasted it once and came back. It was not enough. She did the arithmetic again in the 3rd week. If Cobb Lawton did not return, she had a limited set of options, none of which included keeping the full farm intact. The east field might need to go, or the pasture land, or both. She did not put this in writing. Some calculations are better kept entirely internal. Vic Pruitt from First Caldwell Bank arrived on a Wednesday in the 4th week. He was 45 and wore the kind of pressed khakis that belong to someone who has decided not to be a farmer despite living in a farming county, and he had the manner of someone delivering information he considers a favor. He sat at the kitchen table and explained that the bank was prepared to offer a loan extension. The terms included an extended payment schedule, reduced interest for the first 18 months, and a requirement that the east 80 acres be added to the collateral agreement. Norma listened to all of it without interrupting. The east 80 acres was Clifford's experimental field. The irregular parcel against the low ridge, the warmest section of the property, the ground where the notebooks had been written in real time. She had never considered it separable from the rest of the farm. She said no. Vic looked at her with the careful neutrality of someone who has practiced this expression. He said, Norma, this is a genuinely reasonable offer. The bank is extending significant goodwill here. She said, I understand that. The East 80 is not collateral. He left the paperwork on the table for her to consider. She put it in a drawer without looking at it again. That same evening, Walt Doer's truck appeared at the end of the lane. He came in the way people come in when they want to appear casual about something they have been thinking about carefully. He accepted coffee without sitting down, which was a specific kind of body language that Norma recognized as the posture of a transaction. He stood at the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the fields and made several observations about the weather and the harvest season before arriving at his actual subject. He said, I have been thinking about your situation. Norma said, what situation is that? He set his coffee down. 340 acres is a lot of land to carry alone, especially with a balloon payment coming. She said, I know what I am carrying. He looked at her directly. I am prepared to offer you fair market value on the property. Full price clean transaction. You could pay off the note and have money left over. The room was quiet. Norma looked at him. Walt said, I know this is not what you want to hear, but the Cobb Lawton situation is not going to resolve the way you are hoping. People like him do not come back. She said, people like him, men who drive across the country looking for something nobody else wants. Walt shook his head slightly. They are romantic, Norma. They are not businessmen. She said, he seemed like a businessman to me. Walt picked his coffee back up. Think about it. He moved toward the door. I am not making this offer to be your enemy. I am making it because in 12 months, you are going to have fewer options. He left. Della came into the kitchen 30 seconds later. She had been in the hallway. Norma looked at her. How much of that did you hear? All of it. Della pulled out her phone. She had been doing something on it since before Walt arrived, and now she turned the screen toward Norma. She said Walt Doer had a meeting with First Caldwell Bank 9 days ago. I checked the county meeting records. He is on the Commercial Loan Advisory Board. Norma looked at the screen. Della said he knew about your extension offer before Vic showed up. The room was quiet for a long moment. Norma said he has been waiting. Della nodded. He has been waiting. She thought about Walt standing in the co-op in February, watching the proceedings at the catalog rack, not laughing, just watching. She thought about every conversation since then, the jokes, the skepticism, the casual certainty that her project would fail. She thought about the way Walt had stood in that co-op room, carefully cataloging what she did and said, storing information, building a picture of a timeline. She said he saw the value before anyone else did, Della said, and he wanted to buy the land before someone else recognized it. She was right. The corn had not been invisible to Walt Doer. Walt had been doing exactly what he accused Cobb Lawton of not being capable of doing. He had been doing business. He had simply been doing it in a direction that required her failure rather than her success. The 6th week arrived. No call from Cobb, no email, no word. Norma stood at the edge of the field on a Tuesday evening. The light was the particular gold of late October, the light that makes everything look permanent and finished and irreversible. The harvest was in, the field was bare. The corn had been grown and selected and harvested in the same tradition as 16 years of careful documentation, and it was sitting in a barn waiting for a buyer who had loaded his coolers 5 weeks ago and driven away and had not been heard from since. Della came out and stood beside her. She did not ask if Norma was okay. She had asked that before and knew what the answer was going to be. She said instead, "What are you thinking?" Norma said, "I am thinking about the last page of the notebook." Della waited. She said he wrote it in 1996, a year before he died. She paused. "Somebody will understand it, just not yet." Della was quiet. She said he was not writing that to me. He was writing it to whoever came after him, which was also me. But still, Della said, "And you believe it." Norma looked at the field, at the bare rows in the gold light, at the low ridge where the east 80 acres began, the ground that Vic Pruitt wanted to add to a collateral agreement, and that Walt Doer wanted to acquire through the quiet mechanism of a failed loan. She said, "I have to." They stood there until the light changed. Then headlights appeared at the far end of the farm lane. Della saw them first and stood up straighter. Norma turned. The lights moved slowly with the specific, deliberate pace of a large vehicle reading addresses. Green, dark green, dust on the lower body. Norma stood very still. The truck stopped in the yard. Cobb Lawton climbed out. He was not smiling. He had a thick folder under his arm, and he walked toward them with the purposeful directness of someone who has something specific to say and is choosing the words as he walks. Della and Norma did not speak. Cobb stopped in front of them and stood there for a moment, looking at Norma. And then something shifted in his expression, and he said, "I need to tell you something before we go any further." The night air was cold enough to see breath. Norma waited. She had learned to wait in the way that farmers learn, not patiently, but precisely, as a specific skill applied to specific situations where rushing served no one. Cobb stood in the yard with the folder under his arm and the particular expression of a man who has been traveling toward a conversation for 6 weeks and wants to get it right. He said, "Before I show you any of this, you need to know something is moving." Della stepped forward slightly. "What does that mean?" Cobb looked at her, then at Norma. He said, 3 weeks ago, a procurement broker out of Louisville contacted my distributor asking about Ozark specialty grain sources, specifically asking about small farm heirloom varieties in Caldwell and surrounding counties." He paused. "The broker represents Whitfield Distilling. They are out of Lexington. They are large," Norma said. "How large?" Cobb said. "Large enough to pay more than I can for exclusive supply and sign a 3-year commitment the same afternoon." He looked at her steadily. "I know who their broker is. His name is Kevin Ferris. He has been asking around the county for 2 months. The name arrived in the conversation the way names arrive when people recognize them and wish they did not. Della said Ferris. Cobb nodded. Relation of yours. Della said, relation of Grant Ferris. Who runs the co-op? Cobb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that explains a few things. Norma thought about Grant Ferris calling additional employees over when she brought the corn samples in. She thought about the way he had assessed the corn with the practiced efficiency of someone performing a function rather than making a genuine evaluation. She thought about every time the co-op had been a wall instead of a door, and she considered now whether Grant had understood the value of what she was growing earlier than he had let on. She said, how long does Kevin Ferris have? Cobb said he is meeting with another farm in Greene County next week. If he finds what he is looking for there, you lose the exclusive advantage. He paused. I need to know if you are willing to move forward before that happens. Della said, tonight. Cobb said, if you are willing. He spread the folder on the hood of his truck, and they stood in the cold yard, under the barn light, 3 people around a vehicle hood looking at documents. The lab reports came first. Norma had expected numbers, but the volume of analysis surprised her. Cobb's distillery had run tests she had not known existed, not just sugar content and fermentation rates, but extended mash behavior profiles, flavor compound analysis at different temperature stages, comparison trials against 5 other specialty grain sources. The numbers told the story she had been trying to tell in commercial terms for 3 years, and they told it in the language commodity buyers actually spoke. Cobb walked her through each report. He was thorough without being condescending, which meant he was explaining things to someone he considered capable of understanding them. Norma asked specific questions about the fermentation data. Della asked about the exclusivity clauses in the proposed contract. Cobb answered everything. An hour passed, then another half hour. They moved inside at some point without formally deciding to, and the conversation continued at the kitchen table with the paperwork spread across the surface alongside coffee cups and the remnants of a meal Della had made earlier that evening. The notebook was on the table too, as it always was, and at one point Cobb picked it up and leafed through it with the careful hands of someone handling something that matters. He stopped on a page and read for a moment. Then he looked at Norma. He said, your grandfather understood what he had. She said, he understood it better than anyone else. Cobb set the notebook down gently. He said, the people who knew him, did they think he was wrong? She thought about Bev Tanner, about the people at the co-op, about the steady weight of a community's collective certainty that one man's 30-year experiment was a comfortable eccentricity and nothing more. She said most of them. Cobb said, that is usually how it goes. Della looked up from the contract. She had been reading it line by line for 20 minutes with the focused application of someone who had studied agricultural business law and was applying that knowledge now without apology. She said, the exclusivity window, 3 years with priority right of renewal. What happens if your production requirements change? Cobb said, there is a minimum purchase guarantee in Section 4 that protects you regardless of our production volume. Della found Section 4, read it again, looked at Cobb, said, this is fair. He said, I know it is. I wrote it that way. Della set the contract down. She looked at her mother. She said, Mom. Norma looked at her daughter. Della said, I think you should sign it. It was not a casual statement. It was the specific statement of someone who has spent a long time doubting and has arrived through their own independent analysis at a different position. Norma recognized the difference between Della agreeing because she was tired of disagreeing and Della agreeing because she had looked at every document and reached her own conclusion. This was the second kind. Norma said, yeah. She picked up the pen. The contract signature happened at 11:47 at night at a kitchen table in a farmhouse in Caldwell County, Missouri, with a folder of lab reports and a 60-year-old notebook and 3 cups of cooling coffee as witnesses. The amount was 7 times current commodity market rate for sweet corn. The commitment covered the full 2009 harvest and established priority purchasing rights for the 3 subsequent seasons. Norma would retain all seed stock rights and all varietal documentation. Della read the final page aloud. Then Norma signed. Then Cobb countersigned. Then he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath, the breath of someone who has been holding tension for 6 weeks and is now permitted to release it. He said, "I have been doing this for 22 years. He looked at the contract. "This is the best grain sourcing deal I have ever made." Norma said, "You have not gotten the corn yet." He smiled. "I had the corn. I had it 6 weeks ago." He looked at the contract again. "This is the logistics." The first shipment was scheduled for the following Thursday. Cobb would send a specialized grain trailer, temperature-controlled, with proper humidity management. He reviewed the specifications with Norma in the morning before he left, standing in the barn, going through the storage requirements with the same thoroughness he had applied to everything else. He drove away at 8 in the morning, and this time he was smiling, and Norma stood in the yard and watched him go, and felt something she had not felt in 3 years, which was the specific sensation of a weight shifting. Not disappearing, shifting. Moving from a place where it had been impeding movement to a place where it could be carried differently. Della came out of the house. She stood beside her mother. After a moment, she said, "He is real." Norma said, "He is real." Another moment. Della said, "I am sorry I doubted it so long." Norma looked at her. "Do not apologize for that. I needed you to doubt it." Della frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because if you had not been skeptical, I would have been." She paused. "And I could not afford to be." Thursday came. The specialized trailer arrived at 7 in the morning, a well-maintained unit from a regional agricultural transport company, and the loading process went smoothly. Norma and Della, working alongside the driver through the methodical process of moving the harvest from storage to transport. By noon, the trailer was loaded and sealed and rolling back down the farm lane. Norma watched it reach the county road and turn south. She called Cobb to confirm departure. He answered on the first ring and said the trailer had GPS tracking and he would have confirmation of arrival by Friday afternoon. He sounded, she thought, like a man who genuinely looked forward to receiving a grain shipment. She went inside and started the arithmetic on the bank payment. The call came Saturday morning. Cobb's voice when he answered was controlled in the way voices are controlled when something has gone wrong and the person is choosing how much to communicate before they understand the full extent of it. He said the shipment arrived, most of it in good condition. Most of it. He paused. The front third of the load shows moisture infiltration. Humidity management failed somewhere in transit. He paused again. The driver stopped overnight in Joplin. The trailer was unattended for approximately 9 hours. She said, "How bad?" He said, "The front third is compromised. Not a total loss, but not usable for the primary batch." He paused. "I am going to need to run a full assessment before I know whether the back 2/3 maintains full quality certification." She said, "What about the contract?" He said, "The contract stands. I am not calling about the contract. I am calling because I want you to know before you hear it from anyone else, and because I want to know if you have any idea how a humidity management failure happens to a trailer that was inspected and certified 2 days ago." She said, "I might have an idea." She did not say what it was. Not yet. She needed to think about it carefully the way she thought about everything that mattered, which was slowly and with attention to what she actually knew versus what she suspected. What she knew was this: Walt Doer had told her in passing during one of his several visits that he had connections in the regional transport business. He had mentioned it the way people mention things they want you to know they have. She had noted it and filed it. She had not thought about it again until now. She also knew that the timing of the damage was specific, not in transit, not at the destination, during the 9-hour stop in Joplin, which was the only unattended period in the entire journey. Whoever had accessed the trailer's ventilation system had known the route and the schedule and the stop location. That information was not public. She could not prove any of this. She drove to Walt Doer's farm. She drove the county road the way she had driven it all her life, knowing every mile of it by the feel of the road surface and the landmarks at each curve. She pulled up the long gravel drive to Walt's house and parked and walked to the front door and knocked. Walt opened it with the expression of someone who had not expected to see her there. She said, "Can I come in for a minute?" He stepped back. She walked into the kitchen, which was the kind of kitchen that belonged to someone who lived in it, functional and used and honest in a way his commercial posturing never quite was. She sat down at the table without being invited to. He sat across from her. She said, "I want to talk about the Joplin stop." He said, "I do not know what you mean." She looked at him. She said, "Yes, you do." The room was quiet. She said, "I am not here with a lawyer. I am not recording this. I do not have anything that constitutes proof, and I know that, and you know that." She looked at him steadily. "I am here because I want you to know that I know what happened and roughly how it happened and roughly who arranged it." Walt said nothing. She said, "I also want you to know it did not work. Cobb is running the assessment now. The back 2/3 of the load is intact. The contract holds." She paused. "I paid the bank this morning, full balance." Something moved in Walt's face. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt. Something more complicated, the expression of someone recalculating. She said, "I am not going to make trouble for you. I am going to go home and run my farm, and you are going to continue to run yours. And in 30 years, one of our kids is going to sit in a co-op and tell the other one's kid how the old folks used to argue about corn." She stood up. "But I needed you to know that I know, because that is the kind of thing that matters to me." She walked to the door. Walt said, "Your grandfather was stubborn too." She turned. He said, "I watched him for 20 years. He was right about a lot of things, and he was still stubborn." He paused. "I thought you were making the same mistake." She said, "You thought I was making the same mistake because you were hoping I was." He said nothing. She said, "There is a difference between those two things." She left. The drive home was quiet. Not the tense quiet of unresolved things, but the different quiet that comes after something has been said that needed saying. She did not feel triumphant. She felt clear, which was better. Della was waiting in the yard when she got home. She said, "Where did you go?" "Norma said I went to talk to Walt." Della's expression shifted. She said, "About the shipment." Norma said, "About knowing when something is over." Della looked at her. She said, "Is it over?" Norma said, "Most of it." Cobb's final assessment came back Monday. The rear 2/3 of the shipment had maintained full quality certification through transit. The front third was graded down to a secondary use classification, but not a total loss. Cobb had already contacted 2 additional craft distillers who could use the secondary grade corn in blended batches. Total financial impact to the contract: 11% reduction on the first shipment. Everything forward was unaffected. He called to deliver this information and then said, "I would like to talk about next year." She said, "So would I." He said, "I have already had 2 other distillers contact me asking about your sourcing operation. They want to know if you have capacity to supply additional volume on secondary contracts." She said, "What kind of volume?" He named a number. She was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic, thinking about the east field and the pasture land, and what it would mean to expand the operation in the direction of a real specialty grain enterprise rather than a single buyer arrangement. She thought about Della's agricultural science degree and the way Della had read every line of the Cobb-Lawton contract with the focused attention of someone who intended to be useful. She said, "Let me talk to my daughter." Cobb said, "I thought you might say that." The conversation with Della lasted 2 hours and covered logistics, capital requirements, seed stock management, soil rotation, equipment needs, and the question of whether Della was willing to commit to the farm as a going concern rather than a temporary situation. It was the most productive conversation they had ever had about the farm, because it was the first one they had conducted as equals. Della said at the end of it, "I want to run the expansion." Norma said, "I know. You are okay with that. It is your farm too. It has been your farm this whole time. Della was quiet for a moment. She said, I doubted you. Norma said, you were right to. I told you that. Della said I was wrong about the outcome. Norma said, you were right about the risk. The outcome went a different way. Those are different things. Della looked at her. She said, when did you know it was going to work? Norma thought about this genuinely. She said, I did not know it was going to work. She paused. I knew it was worth trying even if it did not. Della thought about that for a moment. She said, that is what the notebook says, is it not? In the last entry, Norma said, something like that. The co-op visit happened on a Thursday in November. Cobb had come back to finalize the secondary contract logistics and had driven through town on his way to the farm. He stopped at the co-op for coffee, which was either a genuine need for coffee or a specific choice about where to drink it. And Norma had her own opinion about which one it was. Grant Ferris was behind the counter. The room had the same configuration as always, the same people in their regular positions, the same fluorescent light over concrete floors. Cobb walked in, and the room did the thing rooms do when a stranger enters a familiar space. A brief recalibration, a collective reading of who this person is. Grant looked up. Cobb walked to the counter and ordered coffee and paid for it, and then turned to look at Grant Ferris with an expression that was entirely pleasant and contained nothing hostile, and was therefore somehow more significant than hostility would have been. He said, you are the man who told her it was feed grade. Grant said I gave her my honest assessment of the market. Cobb nodded slowly. He said, I know. He picked up his coffee. I wanted to thank you for that. Grant blinked. He said, thank me. Cobb said, if everyone in this room had understood what she had, I never would have gotten exclusive supply. He looked around the room with the same pleasant expression. So genuinely, thank you. He raised his coffee cup slightly. Nobody laughed. The room was quiet in a way specifically different from all the previous quiet in that room. Not the quiet of something obvious being confirmed, the quiet of something being understood that had not been understood before. Walt Doer was standing near the back wall. He did not look at Norma. He looked at the floor for a moment and then out the window at the gray November sky, and his expression had the quality of a man revising a long-held position in real time. Cobb drank his coffee and left. The winter passed. Spring came with the particular decisiveness of spring in Missouri, which announces itself not gradually but all at once. The overnight shift from cold and brown to warm and green that always surprised Norma, no matter how many decades she had watched it arrive. She stood at the edge of the expanded field in early April, looking at the acreage they had prepared for the new season. The East 80 was included now, naturally. The irregular parcel against the low ridge, the warmest section of the property, the ground where Clifford had done his original selection work. It had not gone to the bank. It had not gone to Walt Doer. It was still exactly what it had always been. Della had driven the fence post for the new section herself. 3 additional specialty buyers had come through in March, 2 distillers and an artisan food producer from Kansas City who was interested in heritage grain flours. Each of them had asked to taste the corn before discussing anything else. Norma had noticed this. She had noticed that people who understood what they were looking for always asked to taste it first. She had mentioned this to Cobb on the phone. He had said, that is how you tell the difference between someone who knows quality and someone who is looking for a market. The first question they asked. She had thought about that for several days. On the last afternoon of April, Walt Doer drove up the lane. He parked and got out without the coffee, which was different, and walked to where Norma was standing at the field edge. He looked at the expanded acreage for a long moment without speaking. The corn had been planted the week before, and the first emergence was just beginning, the tiny green spears pushing up from the dark soil in the irregular rows that would never look like commodity corn, but would never taste like it either. Walt said, you know what still bothers me? Norma said, what? He said, I laughed at this. For years. She said, yes. He said, no, seriously. He shook his head slowly. He looked at the field with the expression of someone doing a genuine accounting. Not the casual kind of bothered, where a person says something to discharge a feeling and move on. The real kind. I looked at what you were doing and I laughed at it, and I was watching it the whole time, and I still did not understand what I was looking at. The wind moved through the young corn. The rose caught the late afternoon light. She said, "It took me 3 years to find the right buyer. It took Cobb 3 years to find me. It took my grandfather 16 years to lay the groundwork." She looked at the field. Understanding takes however long it takes. "Walt said I tried to buy your land." She said, "I know. He said I would have broken this up and put commodity corn on it." She said, "I know that too." He was quiet. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." Norma looked out at the rows of emerging corn at the East 80, where Clifford had done his original work at the ridge, catching the late sun at the same angle it had caught it when she was 14 years old, eating corn that tasted like something she could not name. She said, "He planned it, not the buyers or the contracts or the specific outcome." She did not mean any of that. She meant the act of planting something you might not live to see completed. She meant the 16 years of notebooks given to someone who would finish what they described. She meant the last entry written in 1996 about someone who would come later and understand. Clifford Braddock had planned the thing that plans made, which was not a result, but a direction. He had pointed the compass towards something real and made sure someone who loved the land as much as he did would be holding it when the needle finally stopped moving. Walt stood there a little while longer. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. He walked back to his truck and drove away, and the sound of his engine faded down the county road in the afternoon quiet. Della came out of the house and walked to where Norma was standing. She had something in her hands, a small piece of painted wood rough cut, the kind that comes from a board in the barn. She held it out. Norma looked at it. Della had carved the letters herself with a chisel, uneven but legible, and painted them in the kind of careful amateur hand that made each word take its exact meaning seriously. The board said, "Somebody will understand it, just not yet." Norma took it. She held it for a moment. Then she walked to the fence post at the edge of the experimental section, the corner of the East 80, where the ridge began and the soil was warmest. And she fitted the board onto the post and pressed it into place. She stepped back and looked at it. Beside her, Della said quietly, "He was right, you know." Norma said, "He usually was." They stood there as the sun dropped toward the ridge, and the light went gold and long over the whole of the Braddock farm, over the new rows and the old fence lines, and the barn where 2 sets of notebooks now lived side by side. The air smelled of turned earth and the specific mineral clean of an April evening in Missouri, and the corn was just beginning to come up from the ground the way it came up every year, silent and unhurried, and exactly as intended.